It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when she walked in. A little girl, no more than 9, thin and pale, moving carefully on aluminum crutches that looked far too heavy for her arms. Her jeans were pinned up where her left leg should have been, and every step she took made a soft tap, then scrape against the black and white floor of the diner. Most people didn't notice her at first, and the ones who did, well, they turned away. A mother pulled her children closer. An elderly couple pretended not to see her. A group of well-dressed women whispered behind polite smiles, the kind that hide discomfort. The girl said nothing. She just moved from table to table, asking softly if she could sit. And one by one, the answers came back. No, not here, sorry. It wasn't said unkindly. It rarely is. But kindness isn't always about tone. Sometimes it's what you do when no one else will. She was nearly at the back of the diner when she stopped in front of him, a man eating alone, big, broad-shouldered, with a beard and heavy leather vest that marked him as a biker. Tattoos ran down both arms, scars on his hands, and a face that had clearly lived through a few rough years. He looked like the kind of man most parents warn their kids to stay away from. But the girl didn't flinch. She stood there, silent for a moment, then said with a voice just barely loud enough to hear, "Can I sit here?" Everyone else said no. Jack Miller was 45. He'd been riding with the Steel Guardians for more than a decade. The patch on his back had been earned, not through violence, like some assumed, but through loyalty, years on the road, and showing up when it counted. He wasn't famous, wasn't dangerous, but he looked like trouble, and that was usually enough to keep people at arm's length. And maybe that was part of why the girl had asked him. He hadn't turned her away with a fake smile. He hadn't looked through her like she didn't exist. He'd just watched, quietly, curious.
Jack looked up from his burger, set it down, and used his boot to slide the chair across from him out from under the table. "Yeah, kid, you can sit." Her eyes widened, just for a second, and something in her shoulders softened, like she'd been holding up the sky and finally found a place to rest. She moved slowly, carefully, but as she tried to sit, her tired leg gave out. The crutches clattered to the floor. Half the diner turned to look again. Not one person moved. But Jack was already on his feet. He didn't say a word, just picked up the crutches, leaned them gently against the wall, and helped steady the chair. No questions, no lectures, just quiet help. As she settled in, he saw it, the bruise on her cheekbone, faint yellow against pale skin, old but still there, and another, darker one on her upper arm where her jacket had slipped, finger-shaped, adult-sized. His hands tightened on the back of her chair, but his voice stayed calm when he asked, "You hungry?" She nodded, slowly, almost like she didn't trust the question, like she wasn't sure if it was real. Jack flagged down the waitress and ordered grilled cheese, fries, and a chocolate milkshake. "Extra pickles," he added, on the side. She didn't speak much, just nodded and ate, not like a child enjoying a treat, but like someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. Her hands shook as she lifted the sandwich, and Jack, he just sat there, eating his burger slowly, letting her take her time. He didn't ask questions, not yet, but something in his gut told him this wasn't just a case of a tired kid needing a place to sit. Something wasn't right, and deep down, he knew, this wasn't going to end with lunch. It wasn't until the sandwich was nearly gone, until the last fries had been carefully dipped and eaten, that she finally spoke again. Her voice was still quiet, but stronger than before. "I'm not supposed to be here," she said. Jack looked up, set down his coffee, and asked gently, "Where are you supposed to be?" She hesitated, twisting her hands together in her lap. "At home," she said. But the way she said that word, flat, cold, like it meant something very different from what most people think of when they say it, made Jack's chest tighten. He didn't push, just waited, and eventually the story came out in pieces. Her name was Emily. She was 9 years old. After her mom passed away last year, she'd been living with her stepfather, a man named Brian Keller. Jack had never heard of him, but from the way Emily's voice cracked every time she mentioned his name, Jack didn't need much imagination to fill in the gaps. "He hurts me," she whispered, "a lot, and he says I don't deserve food if I can't work." She said it like she was repeating something she'd heard 100 times. Jack leaned back slowly, breathing through the slow burn of anger rising in his chest. This wasn't just about a hungry kid anymore. This was something else. Then came the part that made his blood run cold. "I lost my leg 8 months ago," she said. "He told everyone it was an accident, that I was playing in the garage and he didn't see me when he backed out the truck." She paused. "But he saw me. I was right there. He looked right at me." Jack didn't speak. He just listened, because what she needed right now wasn't reaction. It was someone to actually hear her. Not dismiss, not deflect, just hear her. And then, almost as if it cost her something deep, Emily added one more detail.
3 weeks ago, I heard him on the phone. He thought I was asleep. He said, if I didn't make it, he could cash in the policy, just like he did with my mom. The silence that followed was heavy. Jack had heard a lot in his life: bar fights, confessions, pain, even death. But this was different. This was cold, calculated. Not a man losing control, but a man making a plan, slowly, quietly, behind closed doors. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, financial crimes tied to life insurance fraud are often buried beneath medical explanations or unverified accidents, and when a child is involved, especially a disabled child, suspicion rarely falls on the caregiver. The system, while built to protect, often fails to look close enough. In fact, national reports from the Department of Health and Human Services show that more than 600,000 children in the United States suffer from abuse or neglect each year, and a significant percentage of those cases go unreported or unresolved. Jack knew then what he had to do. He stepped outside and pulled out his phone, scrolled to a contact labeled only one word: brick. The phone rang once. "What's up, brother?" the voice on the other end asked. Jack's reply was firm. "Need every man you can spare at the Rusty Spoon. Now. It's about a kid." Brick didn't hesitate. "We're on our way." Less than 15 minutes later, the street outside the diner began to hum with the sound of engines. One by one, members of the Steel Guardians arrived, big men in denim and leather, the kind of crowd that made people nervous for all the wrong reasons. But these men weren't here to cause trouble. They were here for Emily. They moved with quiet purpose. No noise, no drama, just precision. 2 of them, Tommy and Ray, started knocking on doors around Emily's neighborhood. They weren't threatening. They asked questions kindly but firmly, and the answers they got were chilling. One neighbor remembered hearing screams. Another recalled seeing Emily outside on her crutches months ago, and then never again. A woman admitted she had called child services twice, but never saw anyone follow up. And sadly, that's not uncommon. Research by the National Institute of Health in 2022 showed that nearly 70% of child abuse cases suffer from delayed or inadequate responses due to overloaded systems and lack of evidence. Back at the diner, 3 other members sat with Emily. One of them, Marcus, had worked as a crisis counselor before joining the club. He asked questions, slowly, letting her rest when she needed. She told them everything: dates, bruises, what he said, how often she went without food. Another man, Denny, was a former police officer who'd left the force because he got tired of watching reports get buried. He made the right calls, contacted the right people. He didn't ask for permission. He gave facts and made it clear that if this child ended up dead, someone would be held responsible.
They weren't trying to play heroes. They were trying to make sure Emily never had to go back to that house. Jack never left her side. As she rested, he stayed seated beside her, his presence quiet and strong, the kind of presence that says, "I've got you now." And when the authorities finally showed up, they weren't met with rumors or guesses. They were met with witness statements, medical notes, photos of bruises, and an entire file built on truth. All because one man didn't look away. The hospital room smelled like bleach and something faintly sweet, the kind of smell you don't notice unless you're paying attention. Emily lay in the narrow bed beneath crisp white sheets, a blanket tucked gently over her thin frame. Her face was pale, but her breathing had settled. For the first time in what must have been weeks, she was safe. There were wires, yes, monitoring her heart rate, her vitals, and an IV bag that delivered what her body needed to slowly come back to life. But none of that mattered more than the simple fact that no one could hurt her here. Jack sat beside her. He hadn't left since they arrived. The nurses had brought him a chair, uncomfortable and too small, but he never complained. He watched over her like a sentinel, one booted foot crossed over the other, hands folded on his lap. When she stirred, his voice was the one she heard first. "It's okay, Emily," he'd say. "You're okay now." Outside that hospital room, the Steel Guardians didn't go home either. They took turns in the hallway. They brought coffee to the nurses, food to the social worker, and quietly stood as a shield, not because anyone expected trouble, but because Emily wasn't just a case to them. She was someone's daughter now. She was one of theirs. 3 days passed before the court date was set. Family court, the kind most people never think about unless they've been through it. The judge was a woman in her early 60s, calm and deliberate, with silver-streaked hair and a presence that filled the room. Judge Ellen Carter had presided over hundreds of cases, maybe thousands, but something about this one made her pause. She'd read every page in the file, the witness statements, the photographs, the copy of the insurance policy. And then something else, the letter from the hospital's child psychologist detailing how Emily's demeanor changed the moment Jack entered the room, how she went from silent to speaking, from flinching to reaching out, from fear to trust.
That morning in court, the room was quiet. No press, no spectacle, just those who needed to be there. Emily sat in the front row, wearing a navy blue sweater that someone had brought her crutches resting beside her chair. Her hair was brushed, pulled back with a simple clip. She looked smaller than her age, but stronger somehow, too. Jack sat next to her, his vest folded neatly under the chair, a button-down shirt stretched across his broad shoulders. He looked out of place in that courtroom, and yet absolutely right. The judge cleared her throat and addressed Emily directly. "You've been through a lot, young lady," she said, her voice steady but soft. "And I want you to know, none of it was your fault." Emily nodded, eyes wide. "What we're here to decide today," the judge continued, "is where you will live, where you'll be safe, where you'll be home. Do you understand?" Emily nodded again. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Do you have someone in mind, someone you feel safe with?" There was a long pause, not because Emily didn't know, but because this kind of question carried weight. Slowly, she reached across the space between her chair and Jack's, her fingers curled around his. She looked up at him first, as if to ask for permission. Jack gave the smallest nod, barely more than a breath. Then she turned to the judge and said clearly, "Him. I want to stay with him." You could hear the breath catch in a few places around the room, not gasps, just that quiet sound people make when something hits them in the chest. Jack didn't move. He just held her hand a little tighter. The judge looked at him now. "Mr. Miller," she said, "this isn't temporary. This child will need support, therapy, and care for many years. This is a lifelong commitment. Do you understand what you're saying yes to?" Jack's voice was rough when he replied, "Yes, ma'am, I do."
She smiled. It wasn't the polished, professional smile of the bench. It was real. "Then that's what we'll do," she said, and tapped the gavel once, quietly. 6 months later, the world looked different. The leaves were starting to change, and Emily stood in front of a small house on a gravel road, crutches tucked under her arms, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. The house wasn't fancy: white siding, a wide porch with a swing, and a yard that needed mowing. But to her, it was perfect. Jack had built a ramp for her himself, spent hours getting it just right. There were shelves low enough for her to reach, a bathroom with handrails, a fridge that wasn't locked. She had her own room now, with real blankets, books on a shelf, a nightlight shaped like a moon. On the dresser sat a picture of her mom, and beside it, a photo of Jack and Emily, taken the week before by one of the brothers who knew how to use a camera better than a wrench. And then came the party. It wasn't her real birthday. That had passed while she was in the hospital, but none of the guardians cared. They brought balloons, streamers, presents, and a cake with purple frosting, because Emily had once whispered that purple was her favorite color. There were kids from the neighborhood, other club families, and enough laughter to make the house feel like it had always been full of life. When they told her to make a wish, Emily closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and blew out the candles. Someone asked, "What'd you wish for?" She just smiled and said, "I already got it." Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the last of the motorcycles roared their parting sounds, Jack knelt beside her on the porch. "You good, kid?" he asked. Emily didn't answer with words. She leaned in and wrapped her arms around his neck, held on tight, then whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "I'm home."
Some stories stay with you, not because they're loud or violent or full of drama, but because they remind you that even in a broken world, kindness still matters. That sometimes it only takes one person to listen, one person to care, one person to say, "You matter." That was Jack Miller, a man most would have judged by his leather vest and the scars on his hands. A man who didn't have a degree in child psychology, didn't own a tidy home with picture frames on the wall, didn't know the first thing about raising a child with trauma. But he knew how to stay. And sometimes that's enough. Emily never went back to that house. She never had to explain to another adult why she hadn't eaten in 2 days, never had to hide bruises under sleeves or pretend she fell again. Because one afternoon in a little diner, someone said yes when everyone else said no. And that yes changed everything, not just for her, but for an entire town that had looked away for too long. A school that hadn't asked the hard questions, neighbors who hadn't made the call, a system that had let her fall through the cracks more than once. But in the end, it wasn't a system that saved her. It was one man, and the family he chose to build around her. Now, if this story moved you, if something deep in your chest clenched when she asked if she could sit down, or when she whispered that she wasn't supposed to be there, or when she said, "He saved me," then I want to ask you for something. Not money, not sympathy. Just awareness. Because somewhere, right now, there's another Emily. Maybe in your neighborhood. Maybe in your child's school. Maybe just down the street. And she's waiting for someone to see her, someone to ask the right questions, someone to stop walking past because it's easier not to get involved. So if you believe in protecting the innocent, if you believe that children shouldn't have to prove they're in pain to be believed, if you believe that showing up can change everything, then say it out loud, in the comments. Say, "We see you." Not just for Emily, but for every kid who's been told they're too much, too broken, too inconvenient. Let this story be more than just a story. Let it be a reminder that justice isn't always about courtrooms or headlines. Sometimes it's about showing up with a grilled cheese sandwich and a milkshake. Sometimes it's about saying, you can sit here. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that remind us that humanity still has a heart, that real heroes don't always wear badges or capes, sometimes they wear denim and ride motorcycles, then go ahead and subscribe, because there are more stories worth telling, more voices worth hearing, and maybe, just maybe, by listening, we become part of the change.